For nearly 2 decades, gamers have been asking one simple question. Where the hell is Half-Life 3? What started as a meme has turned into a genuine mystery. The Half-Life series is one of gaming's most influential franchises, redefining storytelling and immersion with each entry. Yet despite its massive success and a cliffhanger ending, Valve has never delivered a continuation. It's been over 15 years since we last saw Gordon Freeman, but why? Well, today we're breaking down exactly what happened. Valve's internal struggles, failed prototypes, and the leaks that revealed the Half-Life 3 that almost was. Development on Half-Life 2 began in June of 1999, just 6 months after the release of the original Half-Life. From the start, Valve aimed to redefine the FPS genre. Company president Gabe Newell made their ambitions clear, stating, "Why spend 4 years of your life building something that isn't innovative and is basically pointless? If Half-Life 2 isn't viewed as the best PC game of all time, it's going to completely bum out most of the guys on the team." Unlike most studios, Valve had no strict deadlines. Newell granted the team a virtually unlimited budget, even promising to personally fund development if necessary. This creative freedom would allow Half-Life 2 to push boundaries, but it also set the stage for the perfectionism that would later plague future titles. Despite internal delays, multiple rewrites, and even a major source code leak in 2003, Half-Life 2 finally launched in November of 2004, and it was definitely worth the wait. Just as Valve set out to do, Half-Life 2 did in fact redefine the FPS genre. With its advanced physics engine, cinematic storytelling, and AI-driven gameplay, it received near universal praise, earning a 96 on Metacritic and selling over 12 million copies. It wasn't just a great sequel, it became one of the most influential video games of all time. With this level of success, a third game seemed inevitable. But rather than a full-on sequel, Valve took a different approach, one that would ultimately leave fans waiting for nearly 2 decades. Rather than following a traditional release model, Valve embraced episodic gaming, a new approach to storytelling where shorter, commercially released installments would continue a larger ongoing narrative. Now, Valve chose episodic content for a few key reasons. First and foremost, Half-Life 2 took nearly 5 years to develop, and Valve wanted to avoid another massive wait for fans. Episodic games meant shorter development times and more frequent content drops, with Gabe Newell saying, "Rather than waiting 6 years for another monolithic release, we can deliver smaller, more focused experiences much more quickly." Changing to episodic content also allowed Valve to experiment with a new development model, that being games as a service. Now, I know in today's day and age, the term games as a service will give most gamers PTSD, but in the early 2000s, this was a far less malicious term. If Valve were to embrace a games as a service model and release episodic content, then it would allow them to iterate and evolve their game based on player feedback. Valve wanted to get a jumpstart on this type of content as they believed the games as a service model was the future of single-player storytelling. And boy were they right and so wrong at the same time. Instead of a full Half-Life 3, Valve planned a 3-part expansion, continuing Gordon Freeman's story, telling a continuous story in manageable chunks. The plan was simple: Half-Life 2 Episode 1 in 2006, Episode 2 in 2007, and Episode 3 in 2008. Each episode would build upon the last, leading to a natural progression of the overall story. At least, that was the idea. Early signs of trouble began with the release of Episode 1. Valve had never developed an episodic game before, and figuring out how to make a smaller, standalone experience while maintaining high quality took much longer than expected. They had to adjust their workflow from a monolithic development cycle to a faster, iterative model, which they struggled with greatly. While developing Episode 1, Valve wanted to improve source engine features, including upgraded facial animations and AI. They also used Episode 1 as a teasing ground for dynamic lighting, new NPC interactions, and physics puzzles, which led to multiple delays. But the issues were more than just technical, as the original story for Episode 1 kept being reworked to ensure it stood on its own while setting up Episode 2. Originally, Valve planned to release Episode 2 just 6 months after Episode 1, meaning late 2006, with Episode 1 being a shorter, more linear expansion of Half-Life 2, about 4 to 5 hours long. Episode 2 was intended to be much bigger and more open-ended, featuring larger outdoor environments, a first for the series, more vehicle-based gameplay, leading to technical challenges, and a more emotionally driven story. especially around Alyx and Eli. But the thing is, Valve kept expanding the episode, turning it into a larger game than originally planned. Alongside this, Valve wanted to showcase their significant source engine improvements, as well as bundle the episode inside the Orange Box, a game collection containing Portal, Team Fortress 2, and Half-Life 2. Since Portal and TF2 were still being developed, Valve delayed Episode 2 so all three games could launch together in one polished package. Unlike traditional game studios, Valve had no publisher-imposed deadlines, meaning they could be perfectionists and constantly tweak and improve their games. Yet this led to their own downfall. In the end, Episode 2 was delayed because Valve kept increasing its scope, upgrading the engine and bundling it with the Orange Box. These delays contradicted the entire point of episodic content. Instead of fast, frequent releases, Valve was now taking traditional game development timelines for smaller installments. This killed the overall momentum for Episode 3, and by the time Valve was ready to work on it, their priorities had shifted elsewhere. After the release of Episode 2 in October of 2007, fans expected Episode 3 to follow within a year, as Valve had promised. But 2008 came and went with no news. Then 2009, then 10, 11, 12. By this point, Valve had stopped talking about Episode 3 entirely. So what happened? Valve had intended for Episode 3 to conclude the story arc started in Half-Life 2, but they weren't interested in simply making more of the same. Unlike Episode 1 and 2, Valve wanted Episode 3 to be truly groundbreaking. The problem? They had no idea how to do that. Valve's development culture was built on experimentation and iteration, meaning that if they weren't fully convinced an idea was innovative enough, they would scrap it and start over. This constant self-imposed pressure led to the project stalling before it even gained momentum. But there was also another factor that led to Episode 3's downfall that Valve never considered. Valve was evolving into something bigger than just a game studio. Half-Life made Valve famous, but Steam made Valve rich. By 2010, Steam was generating billions of dollars, giving Valve little financial incentive to rush another single-player game. Half-Life 2 sold over 12 million copies by that point, but Steam was making more money every single year than Half-Life ever had. Because of this, for the first time, Half-Life wasn't Valve's top priority. Instead of making Episode 3, Valve decided to shift its focus to multiplayer games that would generate them a continuous source of revenue. In 2007, Team Fortress 2 was reworked into a live service game, with microtransactions making Valve millions. In 2008, Left 4 Dead became a major success, leading to Left 4 Dead 2 in 2009, both of which dominated Valve's resources. And by 2011 and 13, Dota 2 became Valve's new biggest cash cow, further pulling the studio away from Half-Life. At this point, Valve had fully pivoted. They weren't a company that made single-player FPS games anymore. They were a company that ran Steam and built live service multiplayer games. By 2010, Episode 3 was effectively dead, despite Valve never officially canceling it, with journalists asking Gabe Newell every few years about its status. But as time went on, his responses became more and more vague and dismissive. After Episode 3 quietly faded away into nothingness, you'd be mistaken to think Valve was done with Half-Life. But behind closed doors, multiple attempts were made to develop Half-Life 3. The issue was that none of these attempts lasted. As I've said countless times, Valve's approach to game development is highly experimental. New ideas are prototyped constantly, but if a project doesn't meet their standards or doesn't feel revolutionary, it gets scrapped and restarted. Because of this, it led to several abandoned versions of Half-Life 3. And, believe it or not, we actually know about a few of these lost Half-Life 3s. This version of Half-Life 3 was designed to be a replayable, ever-evolving experience rather than a standard one-time playthrough. It borrowed ideas from Left 4 Dead's AI director, which dynamically adjusts enemy spawns, difficulty, and encounters based on player behavior. Instead of the classic Half-Life scripted sequences, this version of Half-Life 3 would have procedural story beats that changed from playthrough to playthrough. Basically, instead of pre-scripted fights, the game would adapt enemy placements and tactics based on the player's choices. Also, some missions would randomly alter objectives, forcing players to approach levels in different ways each time they played. But it goes even further, as Half-Life is known for its physics-based puzzles, and Valve considered a system where puzzles would change in real time, forcing players to adapt on the fly rather than memorize solutions. While ambitious, the procedural generation concept faced several major issues. Half-Life games rely heavily on scripted cinematic storytelling, and while procedural generation worked well in multiplayer shooters, it didn't lend itself well to a strong, cohesive narrative experience, resulting in Valve abandoning the idea entirely. At some point in 2012 or 13, Valve explored a version of Half-Life 3 that leaned heavily into squad-based combat and real-time strategy elements. Instead of playing as a lone scientist against overwhelming odds, players would command a squad of rebels in large-scale urban battles. This version focused more on tactical decision-making, meaning you weren't just a grunt, you were a commander in a larger rebellion against the Combine. However, Valve realized that this version felt too different from what fans expected. Half-Life is known for its immersive first-person storytelling and pacing, not large-scale tactical battles. And while a squad-based Half-Life 3 was interesting in theory, it wasn't revolutionary, which meant it wasn't worth pursuing in Valve's eyes, leading to it being scrapped. By 2014, Valve had fully shifted focus to virtual reality, developing their own VR technology with the HTC. It's no surprise that during this time, they also attempted to build Half-Life 3 as a VR-exclusive game. This project was designed to push VR forward. Much like Half-Life 2 pushed physics-based gameplay, Valve wanted a fully immersive Half-Life experience, where players could interact with objects, reload weapons manually, and explore environments in VR. The goal was to redefine first-person storytelling by making the player feel like they were truly inside the world of Half-Life. However, in 2014 and 15, consumer VR was still in its infancy. The HTC Vive and Oculus Rift weren't even publicly released yet, and early VR prototypes were bulky and very low resolution. Valve's vision for Half-Life 3 in VR was far too ambitious for the available technology. Not only that, but Half-Life relies on fast, fluid movements, and VR headsets at the time struggled with giving their users motion sickness. VR games in 2015 were mostly stationary, or used teleportation mechanics, neither of which fit Half-Life's action-heavy gameplay. But at the end of the day, a Half-Life sequel couldn't just be a VR experiment. It had to be a full flagship game. The VR market was too small at the time to justify making Half-Life 3 an exclusive VR title. So Valve decided to put the project on hold while waiting for VR tech to evolve. By 2016, Half-Life 3 was effectively dead, and most of the original Half-Life 2 writing team, including lead writer Mark Laidlaw, had left Valve. Then, seemingly out of nowhere in August of 2017, Laidlaw dropped a bombshell. He posted a blog entry titled Epistle 3, which was a thinly disguised plot summary of what Half-Life 2 Episode 3 could have been. It wasn't an official confirmation, but for fans, it was the closest they would ever get to knowing how the story was supposed to end. Epistle 3 was a narrative outline written in the style of a letter from an older Gordon Freeman, although Laidlaw changed the names of characters to avoid legal trouble. It was clear that this was Laidlaw's way of telling fans what he had originally planned for Episode 3. The story follows Gertrude Fremont and Alyx Vaughn, Gordon Freeman and Alex Vance, as they embark on a final mission against the Combine. The story begins with the Resistance launching one final mission to take down the Combine. Their goal? Find the Borealis, a research vessel lost in time that holds a powerful secret weapon. The ship jumps through different points in history, making it unpredictable and extremely dangerous. Dr. Wallace Breen, the main antagonist of Half-Life 2, was killed in the Citadel explosion, or so players thought. In Epistle 3, it's revealed that Breen's consciousness was transferred into a grotesque alien-like host body, similar to how the Combine repurpose human minds. This suggests that the Combine had been experimenting on human consciousness to prolong their rule. The mysterious G-Man who manipulated events since Half-Life 1 appears once again. His intentions remain unclear, but in this version of the story he claims Alyx as his new asset, much like how he previously controlled Gordon. This suggests that Alyx is now under the same supernatural contract as Gordon, meaning the Resistance may have just lost its strongest leader. In an act of desperation, Gordon and the Resistance rigged the Borealis to self-destruct, using it as a bomb against the Combine. Just before the explosion, the ship jumps through time and disappears, leaving Gordon's fates unknown. The story ends with Gordon left in limbo, mirroring the way Half-Life 2 Episode 2 ended. Just like Episode 2, Epistle 3 ends without a real conclusion. The heroes didn't defeat the Combine, free humanity, or give Gordon any kind of closure. Instead, it implies that the cycle of manipulation, resistance, and tragedy will continue indefinitely. Epistle 3 was never officially acknowledged by Valve. No developer from Valve has confirmed or denied whether this was the true intended plot of Episode 3. However, Laidlaw's departure from Valve and the lack of any Half-Life 3 development strongly suggests that this was the closest fans would ever get to a conclusion. However, hope for Half-Life 3 is not yet lost. Even though Half-Life 3 in VR was scrapped, the idea of a VR Half-Life game stayed alive inside Valve. Over the next few years, Valve continued experimenting, refining VR mechanics and testing smaller prototypes. By 2016, Valve had fully committed to virtual reality. They had developed their own VR hardware, the HTC Vive, and needed a flagship VR game to showcase the technology's potential. And what better game to do it than the franchise known for pushing the gaming industry forward? VR was the next frontier, and Valve saw Half-Life as the perfect franchise to make VR truly impressive, and unlike in 2014 and 15, VR technology had significantly advanced by 16 and 17. Valve's index controllers allowed for finger tracking and realistic hand interactions, making VR gameplay more intuitive. Room scale tracking and improved resolution made a fully immersive Half-Life experience possible, and thus, Half-Life Alyx was developed. As you could have guessed, Half-Life 3 came with massive expectations. Anything short of perfection would be a disappointment. So, Half-Life Alyx was created as a prequel and gave Valve more creative freedom without the burden of continuing Gordon Freeman's story. Upon its release in March of 2020, Half-Life Alyx was universally praised and became one of the highest-rated VR games of all time. With a Metacritic score of 93, Half-Life Alyx was praised for its revolutionary VR gameplay, stunning visuals, world building, and strong storytelling and emotional depth. But the biggest impact Half-Life Alyx had was creating the revived interest in Half-Life 3. Much like the games before it, the ending of Half-Life Alyx ended on a cliffhanger. However, this particular cliffhanger rewrites the timeline, potentially undoing the events of Episode 2. Long story short, Alyx is able to prevent her father's death by changing the past in the game's final moments. This creates a paradox. Now Eli is alive at the end of Alyx, but Alyx herself is missing. The game ends with Eli handing Gordon his iconic crowbar, setting the stage for a potential future Half-Life game. And for the first time in years, Half-Life 3 finally feels possible again. After Alyx's success, Valve confirmed that they are working on more Half-Life projects. However, Valve still follows the same "we don't make games unless we have to" philosophy. If Half-Life 3 happens, it will likely be built on lessons learned from Alyx, perhaps even using VR in some way, shape, or form. Narratively speaking, with the timeline rewritten, Valve has effectively wiped the slate clean for a new game. In Epistle 3, the G-Man was supposed to take Alyx after the Borealis mission. Half-Life Alyx completely rewrites that event, meaning that if a new game is made, the main goal might not be fighting the Combine, it might be rescuing Alyx. This gives Half-Life 3 a more personal motivation for Gordon rather than just stopping the Combine. This means that Half-Life 3 might not be the climactic battle against the Combine that many fans expected. Ultimately, the biggest question isn't how Valve will make Half-Life 3, but if they will at all. Alyx proved that Valve is still willing to revisit the franchise, but only when they have something truly groundbreaking to offer. Whether that means pushing VR forward or returning to traditional FPS gameplay remains to be seen. Until then, Half-Life 3 remains what it has always been, the greatest mystery in gaming.